Today's daf is daf Chaf, and the Gemara starts here with a story. Who Barcha? Barcha is a goat. The Chazal lifta afuma de dana, and the goats spied a kind of a vegetable, probably a turnip, that was resting on top of a chavis. So in order to get access to eat this lefes, which is a normal pattern for behema, the goat, jumped on the chavis. So sarich solik, right? It grabs onto the chavis with its feet and starts, jumping up and down in order to climb onto the chavis. It ate the turnip and at the same time broke the chavis. So the case came in front of Rava. In other words, Rava made him pay for both the turnip and also for the chavis. Nezek sholem. Now, nezek sholem would make sense in the case of Shein Bershus Hanizak. So we're going to have to assume that this took place in the Rishus of the Nizak. And as far as anticipating the goat to eat the turnip, apparently goat's food includes turnip. So when the goat digs into the chavis with its paws as it's climbing up in order to eat the lefes and breaks the chavis, then we can assume that to the same extent it's normal behavior and it's predictable for the goat to eat the lefes, then in doing so, it's going to be also anticipated that it will break the chavis. Because otherwise, if he doesn't climb up onto the chavis, how is he going to get access to the lefes, to the turnip? And therefore, if in both cases it's urche, then there's going to be a chiyuv of shein and not keren, because keren is always lav urche. Omar ilfa behema b'shus haramu poshta tzavara v'ochla me'al gabi chaverta. If an animal is standing rooted in rishus harabim, but it stretches its neck out to eat food that is al gabi chaverta. Now we're talking about shein. And shein b'rshus harabim is potter, because it says ubir b'steyachin. And yet ilfa chayeves, ilfa paskin, that the status here of shein is b'rshus hanizak. My timer. Gabe chaverta kechatzar nizak dom. The bala behema, whose animal is being taken into rishus harabim, nevertheless the gav, the back of the animal, is considered like the chotzer of the nizak, of the bal behem, and therefore it is shein b'rshus hanizak. Lema Messiah, let's bring a raya from a brisa to support ilfa. Hoisa kupaso mufleshes leachorov. Right, a man has some sort of a knapsack, and inside the knapsack he keeps his possessions, his articles, and it's on his back, as we said before. Upashta, an animal stretches tzavar, its neck v'achol mimenu, and inside the knapsack there were food, and this is again shein. Then chayeves, despite the fact that this took place in rishus harabim. And the answer is that since the animal was eating from a keli, that keli, even in rishus harabim, becomes the private chotzer, and in this case, the rishus hanizak of the bala behema, of the bala ochel, excuse me. Kida Amar Rava, and the Gemara now rejects this. The Gemara says your analogy is not fair, because Rava reinterprets the case of kupaso mufsheles lachorov, bekofetzes. Now, where did Rava make the statement of kofetzes? That we'll see very soon. Let's not jump to that yet. But rather, here also, we're going to apply Rava's commentary of kofetzes. So we're talking about an animal that jumps and eats from the kupa. And this is unusual behavior. And therefore, we're not talking about the Av of Shane, but rather we're talking about the Av of Karen. And Karen is Chai B'Shus Harabim. But you can't prove from this case of Kupasu Mufsheles that indeed that which is on the back of the animal is called Chotzer HaNizak or Rishus HaNizak. No, it's Rishus Harabim. And the reason Yechayev is because of Shinui, of Mishuna, of Lav Urche of Karen. And Karen is Chayev Rishus Harabim. So the Gemara now asks for Heicha Itma de Rava. Where did Rava say this comment that we're talking about Kofetzes? Ahad, the Omer of Oshia, the statement of Rav Oshia, Behema B'Rishus Harabim. If an animal is eating in Rishus Harabim, Holcha v'Achla P'tura, Amda v'Achla Chayeves. A distinction of Rav Oshia that's very ambiguous. What difference does it make whether the animal is moving, is walking, or it's standing in its place? Maishna holcha. Why is it that in the case of holcha, when the animal is eating in Rishus Harabim, which means that Shane is poter Rishus Harabim Yechayev because it's Mishuna, you're going to have to say that it's Urche. And if it's Urche, it's Darko Shel Behema, that as it's walking, it will eat. And therefore, Holcha v'Achla P'tura, we would place this under the category of Shane, because it's Urche, for an animal to walk and eat. And Shane is Poter B'Shus Harabim. So why then is Omda v'Achla Chayeves? Perfect Gemara Omda Nami Urche Omarav Rava Kofetzos. The case of Omda means it stood and jumped. Kafza v'nemda v'ne'emda al raglei achoranit. The animal was standing on its back two legs as it jumps, and that's lav urche, and therefore comes under Keren, and Keren b'Rishus Harabim is chayev. Boy, Rabbi Zera misgalgal. What's the din of a behema that takes something from one rishus, foodstuff, and rolls it into another rishus? What determines the nature of the chiyuv mazik? Do we look at the place from which he took the machol, or from the place that he actually ate the machol? Hechidom, what's the case? He going. The Kamma Amir is a package made of straw. B'Rishus HaYachid. The behem, on the other hand, is standing in Rishus Harabim. Even though the Amir is in Rishus HaYachid, the actual Achila took place in Rishus Harabim, because the animal was Megalgel the Amir from one Rishus to another, in this case from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus Harabim. What's the din? If we're going to determine the din based on where the animal picked up the ochel, the netila, then the netila wasn't Rishus HaYachid. And if it's Rishus HaYachid, he's chayav mishum shein. But if we determine the nature of this mazik and its category by the place where it actually ate the food, that took place in Rishus Harabim. And shein Rishus Harabim is poter. Tashma, the Gemara says, I could be poshet this suffix from the Brisa Reb Chia. The Tani Reb Chia Masoi. Masoi is a package of food, like, for example, a sack that's full of, let's say, barley seeds or whatever it is. Miktsaso bifnim. Bifnim always means in the Rishus HaYachid. Miktsaso bachutz means half of it is outside the Rishus Harabim. Achla bifnim chayeves. Achla bachutz p'tura. If the animal eats in the Rishus HaYachid, he's chayev. If it eats outside the Rishus Harabim, it's poter, which makes sense because Shein is poter Rishus Harabim. My love, shouldn't we assume that the Bryce is talking about misgalgil v'yasid? That the animal was megalgil, this sack of food, as we said before, the masui that was made of garine sa'orim, full of garine sa'orim, from one rishus to the other. So the Bryce is saying the following: Lachlaso bifnim, meaning it was megalgil from rishus harabim into rishus hayochid, it ate in rishus hayod chayeves, because the achila determines the nature of the mas, and the achila here was rishus hayochid. So even though the netila, when the animal picked up this masui, was in rishus harabim, nevertheless, since the achila was bifnim, therefore he's chayav. If, on the other hand, it was just the reverse, and the achila was bachutz, then bachutz means in rishus harabim, and the makom of the achila is kovea the nezek, and here it was shein rishus harabim, and therefore he's pot. Gemara says lo, and the Gemara rejects this attempt to be poshet the suffix of Rab Zera from this price. Ema, perhaps we could suggest that the intention of the price is just the opposite. That Gilgala, if the animal rolled the food from one rishus to the other, v'achla, then al masha b'fnim chayeves, al masha b'chutz p'tura. What is left, as it were originally inside, meaning b'fnim rishus hayachid, where the netila was, he's chayev, because shein is chayev rishus haniza. So even though the achila took place outside in the rishus harabim, but what's kovea here is the netila, which was in rishus hayachid. Ve'al masha b'chutz, meaning if the netila was in rishus harabim, and then he went in the opposite direction, picking it up in rishus harabim, and then taking it inside to the rishus hayachid, to the rishus hanizach, p'tura. Even though he ate it in rishus hayachid, rishus hanizach, nevertheless the netila is kovea. The makom netila was in rishus harabim. Ibais ema. And another way I could reject this raya, ki ka'amar Rabbi Chia, because the brisa Rabbi Chia was bipsila da aspasta. Aspasta is translated to Hebrew as shachas. I believe the English translation, if I remember correctly, is alfalfa. Now, these alfalfa leaves are very long. So the brisa that Rabbi Chia quotes is not talking about a sack that was full of garini siorim, and he was megalgalit from one rishus to another, but rather it was a reference to chavilas shachas, or in Aramaic, aspasta. And as we said before, these are very long, and part of it was munach, was resting in Eresh Sayyachid, part of it was resting in Rishus Harabim. When the animal ate it, so if it eats one corner, one extreme part of the shachas, then what's going to happen is that part of it is going to be nimshach litzad hasheni. So we're going to define or judge the chavila as being located, being munach, in the place where the animal is eating it. Because as we said before, it's munach in two reshuyos. So when the animal eats it, it sort of like drags it in towards itself. But in the case of a sack full of barley seeds, which are not nimshach, there's no meshicha, then if the behemoth is megalgalit from one rishus to the other, we don't know whether the koveh is the makom netila or the makom achila. The Mishnah had established that shein is mu'edes lecholas haroil. Like, for example, an animal usually eats food. It doesn't eat garments or vessels. I remember when my children were young, we used to read a book to them. I forgot the name of the book right now. One of these children's books in which in the circus, what happened was a guy was blowing a bugle, and the ostrich stretched out its mouth and ate the bugle. But usually animals don't eat bugles, So therefore, the Mishnah says ochla ksuso kelim, which again is mishuna, and therefore comes under keren, and therefore the bailam will pay chatzi nezek like a short time. But all this is in Rishus HaNizak. If it happens in Rishus HaRabim, potter. Now, why would Shane be potter in Rishus HaRabim? Hey, what is the case of Shinui in the Mishnah? And on this, we're going to have a machlokas samurai. We want to pater up Shane from paying in Rishus HaRabim. Is that only on the Reisha? The Reisha is a case where the animal ate kedarka, it ate ochel. Or does it apply even in the case of the Seifa when the animal ate garments or vessels? Amar Rav Hakulu. Rav says that this din of achilas habehema applies straight across the board. The Mishnah will apply that din whether or not it eats foodstuff or it eats ksus, garments or kelim. As long as it took place in Rishus HaRabim, you're pot. And the Gemara asks, my time, that doesn't make any sense. Because if an animal doesn't normally eat ksus or kelim, then in Rishus HaRabim you should be chayav because lav urche, and that's a tolda of keren, and therefore it's keren tam, my time. But the answer is, says Rav, that the person who put down his ksus or kelim, that's not the accepted pattern. And therefore, Kol Mishana, the Nizak, meaning the owner of the Ksus or Kelim, was Mishana. Mishana means he didn't put it in a place where normally people would put it. He left his garments or his vessels in Rishus HaRabim, even though when the animal came and ate the garments or the vessels, that was a shinui potter. In other words, the Baal HaMazik, who l'chor should be chayev for, let's say, Keren versus Harabim, has an argument, a claim against the Nizak. Why did you put your Kalim or your Ksus in a place where no one would do such a thing? That's called Shinu. This principle, by the way, you should underline because we're going to come back to it over and over and over again. So this is so far the opinion of Rav. We're going to see other Amoraim, Reish Lakish, and others that agree with Rav. But right now, the Gemara injects the dissenting view of Shmuel. Shmuel Amar, Lo Shanu Ella Peirus V'Yirachos. We should not accept Rav's interpretation of the Mishnah Akulu, and it refers even to Ksus V'Kaleb. No. It's only referring to the Reisha of Peiros V'Yirachos. Avol Ksus V'Kaleb Chayeves. Meaning, then in the case of Ksus V'Kaleb, we're going to apply the principle of Keren, it's Mishuna, and Keren is Chayev and Rishus HaRabim. Now, the next word in the Gemara is V'chein. It's a little bit ambiguous. The V'chein here goes back to Rav, not to Shmuel. V'chein Amar of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish agrees with Rav. And the P'tur of Shein Rishus HaRabim applies not only to Ochel, but also to Kalim and to Ksus, because Kol Mishana. The Azda Reish Lakish Tameh. Where do we find that Reish Lakish applies the principle of Kol Mishana Ubacha V'Shina B'Patur? The Reish Lakish, the Gemara later on in Chav Daled Amid Beis, Shtei Paros B'Rishus HaRabim, Achas Revutza V'Achas Ma'aleches. One is lying on its back and kicking up its feet. The other one is walking. Ubata Ma'aleches B'Revutza P'Tura. If the animal that's walking now kicks the animal that's laying on its back on the ground, that's revusa, is p'tura. And the question is why? L'chora ba'ata, as we said many times in this Masechta, is a told of Keren. It's Kavanos lahazik, and he was taking advantage of this animal. She was taking advantage of the animal that's lying on the floor, and you should be chayav for Keren. But the answer has to be Kol Mishanu B'Achar V'Shina Bo Potu. That Rish Lakish holds, like we saw in Rav, that for an animal to lie down on its back in Rosh Hashanah and kick up its feet, that's not normal behavior, and that's going to alleviate the mazik of his obligation to pay and compensate the nizar. However, Ravutza b'maleches chayeves. If the parah that was kicking up its feet kicked the maleches, that is exactly the case of Keren, Shor, Tam, Peis Chatzinez, because that's Kavanos lahazik. And you can't blame the Nizak for walking with his animal in Rosh Hashanah. We allow people to walk with their animal in Rosh Hashanah. Now Rabbi Yochanan is going to go back and accept the Shita of Shmuel. Lo shanu ella peres v'yerakos. Aval ksus v'kelim chayeves. In the case of ksus v'kelim, there's a chiyuv of Keren, and we're not going to apply the principle of Kol Mishana. Lemish, we say Rabbi Yochanan less later Reish Lakish. Did Rabbi Yochanan reject the principle of Kol Mishana of V'achar V'shita B'Potur, V'afilu V'shtei Paros, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan would hold that even in the case of Ba'ata B'Maleches, of Ba'ata B'Maleches B'Ravutza, then he'd be chayav, even though why is your animal laying down on its back in the middle of Rosh Hashanah? That's Shita. Gemara says, lo. The Gemara wants to defend the position that even Rabbi Yochanan accepts the principle that if Batam Aleches Biravutza, just 1 second, just going to get the case straight again. Bata Leches. There's a mistake here in the Masifta. I got to write a letter to the editor here. Reish Lakish said, just double check me on this, that Bata Param Aleches Biravutza is Pata. 1 second, Bata. Now I'm getting myself a little bit. Bata Mahaleches. Yeah, that's what it says here. Bata Maleches Biravutza Pata. Here he says Bata Maleches Biravutza Chaya. What's a mistake in the Masifta? So that even Rabbi Yochanan could agree, Reish Lakish, that if the Be'ita was on the Ravutza and the Ravutza had no right to do so, and that's called Kol Mishana, is Pata. Now, if that be the case, then how do we justify Rabbi Yochanan who says, Aval ksus v'kelim chayeves? We said that he had no right, and it wasn't anticipated that he would leave his ksus v'kelim in the middle of Rosh Hashanah. Zok the Gemara to explain Rabbi Yochanan, ksus avdi inish de manchi glimo mistafche. It's derech b'nei adav to put begadim in Rosh Hashanah. Like, for example, a man takes a break as he's walking through Rosh Hashanah. He's got a heavy package, and he puts it down. So therefore, this is not a case of Kol HaMishana. It's not Kol HaMishana. Aval behem alav urche, for an animal to be rovates on the ground and kick up its feet, that's not, in the middle of Rosh Hashanah, that's not acceptable behavior. And then we apply the principle of Kol HaMishana. Okay, at this point, we start a brand new sugya. Okay. The Mishnah says on Daf Yutes Amud Beis that imnenes mishalemes mashenenes. So pshein we said is poter mishus arabim. So you don't have to pay the full value of the payros that the that the animal consumed in Rosh Hashanah, but you do have to pay for the supper, the dinner, that the Baal HaPorah saved himself, which is called Masechet, the Kamma. How do you shots up? How do you define Masechet? And here we have a machlokas between Rabba and Rav. Rabba Omar Dmei Amir. What does that mean? Amir, we said, was straw, teven, and the animal ate something very expensive. Let's say, for example, the animal ate sa'orim, which are worth 100. But what kind of supper did you save the Baal HaBehema from that evening's feeding of the animal? The animal does not normally get fed sa'orim. Sa'orim are very expensive. So the Baal HaBehema HaOcheles has the right to say that, look, the hana that you gave me is equal to a dinner of kash v'teven. I'll pay you the value of kash v'teven, of amir. I'm not going to pay you the value of sa'orim. Rava Omar, Tmei sa'orim b'zol. Rava says, look, Lamaisa, the animal ate sa'orim, and the payment for hana has to reflect the extra hana that the animal got, that it got a very fancy, 5-star meal, and it ate sa'orim. And therefore he has to pay for Tmei sa'orim. But Tmei sa'orim itself lends itself to a split. There's Tmei sa'orim in the shuk, the shar of the shuk, and then there's the slash price of siorim. Let's say, for example, there's a closeout sale of siorim, and that's called Tmei siorim bizol. And the Rishonim say that Tmei siorim bizol is equal to 2/3 of the shar shebashuk. And in that sense, we accept the taina of the mazik that I wouldn't have fed my animal siorim. It's too expensive. So he pays 2/3 of their mechir. And if I understand this Gemara correctly, Rav is the machmir and Rabba is the maker. Because Tmei Amir is much, much less than even siorim bizol. Tanya Kavosi de Rabba, Tanya Kavosi de Rava. Tanya Kavosi de Rabba, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai Omar. If an animal eats siorin in Rosh Hashanah, ein mishalem es al Tmei Amir bilvad. The Tanya Kavosi de Rava, im nenes mishalem es v'shneis keitzad ochla kavo kabay mein Omer shit shalem Tmeya. Tmeya means the mechir of the shuk, but rather el omdim we estimate Kamma adam rotzel la'achil behemto l'dover royal. In other words, we would not normally feed the animal a massive volume of sa'orim, that's kav or kabayim, but rather, one second, I'm sorry, ela omdim kama adam rotza lahachil lebehemto dover roila, meaning the midah, the volume that he would normally give it. And afal pi she'eno ragil, even though it doesn't usually eat sa'orim, the animal usually gets fed kashos or teven, he's going to have to give the balha, the nizak we'll call it, the value of siorim, but not according to the volume that the animal actually ate. Lefichach achla chitim odavarela pot. If we're considering what the animal normally eats, then there are certain things that you don't feed the animals, they're detrimental, and therefore that's not considered hana. Amalei Rav Chizda. Okay. Now, my friend, we're learning a brand new sugya. This sugya that we're about to embark upon is one of the most famous sugyas in Shas, especially in Ezekiel, I should say. And it's called Zenene V'Zelo Choser and Kofel Midas Tom. You weren't with us yesterday in a place called Tchuma when we discussed a very important question. So we asked something. We were studying analyzing very serious. So Rami Bar Chama says, "My Mili Malisik, please give me an insight. What were you discussing? What did I miss? I was too far away to attend the shir." Amalei, Rav Chizr responded, we had a suffix about Hadar b'chatza chaver shlo midaito. A man we call it in English squatters' rights, right? I pack into your chotzer. You're not living there, and I'm going to live in your chotzer. So tzorach lahalos scharo eno tzorach. Does he have to pay rental fees? I mean, there was no rental agreement. If we talk about a case where this, let's call it chatzer, right? This chatzer was not meant to be rented out. It's not on the rental market. And the person who packed into the chatzer and lived there, dwelled there, would not have paid rent. He has another place with a roof over his head. In such a case, there's no question that he's potter. Why? Because that's the principle called zelo nene v'zelo chasa. I didn't benefit by living in your chasa because I have a roof over my head elsewhere, and not only that, you didn't take a loss at all. Ella, shall we say that the suffix of Rav Chizda is bechatzer the kaimeli agra, begavra the ovid lemega, the other extreme, that this chotzer was on the rental market, and the person who squatted would have paid rent. In such a case, again, Rav Chizda would not have vacillated. It's crystal clear that he has to pay. However, zen nene v'zeh chaser. What about a? I'm sorry. So that's zen nene v'zeh chaser, right? You have two strikes against you. You saved yourself rental because you would have rented a place, and he lost the rental because he was going to rent it to someone else. Lo tzricha b'chatzar b'chatzer to lo kaimeli agra v'gavra the ovid lemega. It has one of the two elements, namely the gavra is ovid lemega. He needs a roof over his head. He's willing to pay rent. But on the other hand, the Baal HaChotzer has no interest, nor did he go ahead and put the chotzer on the market. How do we understand this? And this is Rav Chizda's suffix. One side is to say, Motzi Amalei Mai Chisartich. There was no Chisara. What generates my chiv to pay you is the fact that you suffered a loss. I didn't cause you any loss. It was lo kaimi liagu. O Dilma, what should we say? Motzi Amar, the Baal HaChotzer could say to him, wait a minute, lo is Hanes? The Machayev here of Tashlumin is not my loss, but it's your Hana. Did you not get any Hana? You would have rented a place and you would have paid rental fees. So therefore, you have to pay me the rental fees.